If King Varen had ever once turned his head to look at his own mother, someone else would have noticed her long before Sorel did, and Sorel could have gone on carrying trays for the rest of her natural life without a single thing changing. But he hadn't. And no one had. And so it fell to a tavern girl with ale drying on her apron to be the first person in 9 years to say anything at all to the Queen Mother of Aldmere. She did it fittingly, without making a sound. It was not supposed to be her night. Sorrel poured for the low tables at the Hollow Oak 6 days a week, and on the seventh she slept. But the palace kitchens had underestimated the feast the way palace kitchens always did, and when the steward's men came down into the lower city looking for hands that could carry a tray without spilling it on a duke, Sorrel's name was the first out of the innkeeper's mouth. So here she was, in a borrowed grey dress 2 sizes too severe, threading between the long tables of the great hall with a jug in each hand, and her eyes down, where a servant's eyes belonged. She had a gift for going unseen. It was the only thing she truly owned. A girl who could move through a room without leaving a ripple could hear a great deal, and Sorrel heard everything. Which noble was selling grain he didn't have, which was terrified of his wife, which laughed too hard at the king's jokes and hated him underneath it. She filed it all away out of habit, the way her mother had taught her to watch hands when she couldn't watch mouths. Her mother had been deaf. Sorrel had signed before she'd spoken, had spent her whole childhood in the particular quiet of a house where love was made of hands and faces and the space between them. When her mother died, the quiet had gone with her, and the world had become a loud, careless place that talked over everyone it had decided not to hear. Which was why Sorrel noticed the Queen Mother when no one else in the hall did. Ondine sat at the high table in the place of honor, and she was the loneliest person Sorrel had ever seen. She was beautiful still, silver-threaded through dark hair, her spine straight as a blade, but the feast happened around her the way weather happens around a stone. Nobles leaned across her to reach one another. A councilman told a long story past her shoulder, and everyone laughed and she smiled a half-beat late, guessing, the way you smile when you have learned that guessing is safer than asking. No one spoke to her. No one had, Sorrel would learn, in a very long time. They had simply decided that a woman who could not hear was a woman who was no longer there. Sorrel knew that particular cruelty in her bones. It got worse. A young lord 2 seats down, wine-flushed, pleased with himself, caught his neighbor's eye, tipped his head toward the Queen Mother, and said something behind a lifted cup. Sorrel was close enough refilling the water to read it plainly off his lips. Watch, she won't know either way. Then he raised that same cup toward Ondine, gave her a warm, false, courtier's smile, and said, mouth wide and slow and mocking, "To your health, you deaf old relic." His friend choked on a laugh. The Queen Mother inclined her head graciously and thanked him with a small gesture of her hand, because she had read to your health and nothing worse, and had no reason to think a man would smile at her like that while gutting her. Something in Sorrel's chest went very still and very hot. She should have kept pouring. She knew that even as her hands set the jug down. A serving girl did not correct a lord. A serving girl did not exist. But her mother had died being smiled at by people like that, and Sorrel found she had already stepped into the Queen Mother's line of sight, and before her sensible self could catch her wrist, her hands were moving. "He is not toasting your health," Sorrel signed, small and low against her apron where only the high table could see. "He is mocking you. He thinks you can't tell." The Queen Mother went absolutely rigid. For one horrible moment, Sorrel was certain she'd guessed wrong, that the old signs from a lower city deaf household meant nothing to a queen, that she'd just made a fool of herself in front of the crown for nothing. Then Ondine's dark eyes lifted to her face, wide and disbelieving, brimming with something Sorrel had no name for, and her hands came up off the table. "You speak," Ondine signed. "Just that, you speak." "A little," Sorrel answered. "My mother taught me," and then the Queen Mother of Aldmere, who had not been spoken to in 9 years, began to talk, quick and hungry and overflowing, her hands flying, telling this stranger in grey that the wine was too sweet and the lord was a peacock and his father had been a peacock before him, that she had been watching the hall for hours and no one had said one true thing to her all night, that she had almost forgotten what her own thoughts sounded like when someone was listening. She laughed, out loud, a startled, rusty human sound, and reached across the table to take Sorrel's wrist in her hand. And Sorrel forgot entirely that she was a servant, and signed back, dry as a bone, "The peacock has soup on his collar," and the Queen Mother laughed again, helplessly, tears standing in her eyes. That was when Sorrel realized the hall had gone silent, not the ordinary hush of a feast between courses. A total, spreading, unnatural quiet, table by table, as every noble in the great hall turned to stare at the Queen Mother, the ornament, the relic, the woman who reacted to nothing, laughing and weeping and speaking with her hands to a tavern girl in a borrowed dress. 200 people, and not one of them could understand a word passing between the two women, and every one of them could see that it was the realest thing that had happened in that hall all night. Sorrel's heart dropped straight through the floor. She let go of the Queen Mother's hand and stepped back and back again, and the enormity of what she'd done rolled over her all at once. She had touched a queen, she had presumed, in front of the whole court, a nobody with ale on her apron. There would be a price for this. There was always a price. And at the head of the hall, in the great carved chair she hadn't dared look at all night, the King of Aldmere rose slowly to his feet. She looked up at him then because she couldn't help it. Varen was young for a crown and did not wear it easily. Dark-haired, sharp-jawed, a stillness to him that the whole room bent toward, without knowing it did. He was staring at his mother as though he had never seen her before in his life. Then his gaze moved and found Sorrel and fixed there. He came down off the dais. He crossed the silent hall and every head turned to track him, and Sorrel stood rooted to the flagstones with nowhere to run, and no idea on this earth whether the King of Aldmere was about to thank her or have her thrown in a cell. He stopped an arm's length away, close enough that she had to tip her chin up to hold his eyes, and he opened his mouth to speak. She never heard what he said. That was the cruelty of it, and Sorrel would turn it over for days afterward, that the king of all Aldmere had opened his mouth to pronounce her fate, and in that exact moment the steward's man seized her hard by the elbow from behind, hissed, "You're done here," and hauled her bodily out of the hall through the servants' arch before a single word had left the king's lips. The last thing she saw was Varen's face changing, one hand lifting as if to stop it. Then the door swung shut and the noise of the hall was gone, and she was being marched down a cold stone passage toward the kitchens and the night, and she was fairly sure, the end of everything. By morning she was back in the lower city, in the room over the Hollow Oaks stable that she shared with two other girls, and she had not slept at all. "You touched her." Bex sat on the end of the cot with her arms folded, and Bex was the closest thing Sorrel had to a sister, which was why she wasn't pretending it was fine. Bex was older, harder, had served in 3 houses and been thrown out of 2, and she knew exactly how the world above the river worked. "You touched the Queen Mother, in front of the court, with your hands." "I was talking to her." "Nobody talks to her. That's the point of her." Bex dragged both hands down her face. "Gods, Sorrel, do you understand what you did? You made 200 lords look small. You stood in that hall and showed every one of them a thing they were too lazy or too cruel to do for 9 years, and you did it in a borrowed dress. They will hate you for that. Shame turns to hate faster than anything on this earth." "She was being mocked," Sorrel said. "To her face. I couldn't just—" "You could have. Everyone else did." But Bex's voice cracked in the middle of it because they both knew Sorrel couldn't have, not with her mother 9 years in the ground and the same smile on that lord's face. Odo arrived at midday, breathless, having run the whole way up from the market with his ears full of it. He was 15 and worked the palace scullery and thought Sorrel had hung the moon, and he stood in the doorway with his cap in his hands and his eyes like saucers. "It's everywhere," he said. "The whole city. They're saying a tavern witch bewitched the Queen Mother with hand signs. They're saying you cursed the wine. Sorrel, they're saying Steward Corwin's going to lose his post for bringing you in. The whole hall knows it was his hands that hired the extra girls, and the court's baying for someone to answer for the spectacle, and it won't be a lord, will it?" Sorrel's stomach turned over. Corwin had pulled her out of the gutter when she was 11 and her mother's body was barely cold, had found her stealing bread, and, instead of the magistrate, had found her honest work and a roof, and, over the years, something almost like a father's care. Every good thing in her life since had come through his hand, and now she'd cost him the position he'd spent 30 years climbing toward, in a single night, over a jug of water and a queen no one wanted. "There's more," Odo said, lower now, and he glanced back at the stairs as if the street itself might be listening. "The lord you shamed, the peacock, that was young Lord Aldous of House Vane, and House Vane doesn't forgive being laughed at. My cousin runs errands for their steward, and he says half the great houses have had their heads together since dawn. Not about the Queen Mother at all, but about you, about who you are and where you came from, and who let a lower city girl walk into the palace and make the crown look foolish." He swallowed. "Sorrel, They're not frightened of a witch. They're frightened of a witness. That's what my cousin said. He said the wrong people are asking why you were really in that hole. Sorrel didn't understand it yet. Couldn't have. But the words settled into her like a splinter she wouldn't be able to reach for weeks. Why were you really in that hole, as though someone had already decided her being there was no accident and needed it not to be? I have to go to him, she said, already reaching for her shawl. I have to explain. You have to hide, Beck snapped. You go up to that palace, they'll put you in a cell and lose the key. Sit down. She didn't sit down, but she didn't get to the door either, because that was when the knock came. 3 hard raps that went straight through the thin wood and stopped all 3 of them cold. Nobody in the lower city knocked like that. That was the knock of someone who had never once in his life been refused. Bex opened it a crack and went white and stepped back. A palace messenger filled the doorway in the king's own colors, and he did not look at Bex or Odo at all. He looked at Sorrel and consulted a folded paper and said in the flat voice of a man reading a sentence, Sorrel of the Hollow Oak, you're summoned to the palace, now. By the steward? She managed. The messenger's eyes flicked up, and for the first time something like curiosity crossed his face, as though he could not fathom what a tavern girl had done to earn what he was about to say. By the king, he said. He asked for you by name. They dressed her in something better than grey and made her wait in an antechamber with a floor that cost more than the hollow oak, and Sorrel spent every minute of it certain she was about to be sentenced. She had built the whole thing in her head on the walk up through the terraces, the cold room, the charge read out, Corwin standing to one side unable to meet her eye because she'd ruined him too. She had even decided how she'd stand when they said it. Chin up. She would not weep in front of the court. She'd wept enough in front of people who'd smiled while they did their worst. So when the doors opened onto the king's receiving hall, and she saw the court arranged in its cold rows, and Corwin among them grey-faced and rigid, and the king himself waiting at the far end, she walked the length of that hall with her chin exactly where she'd promised it would be, and she thought, let it come then. There she is, said King Varin. It was not the voice she'd braced for. There was something almost delighted in it, and it stopped her dead 3 paces off. My mother, the king went on, to the whole court, not to her, has not spoken to a living soul since my father died. 9 years. I brought her physicians. I brought her scholars who claimed they knew the finger alphabet out of books. I brought her, gods forgive me, a priest who thought he could pray the silence off her. Not one of them reached her. He let that sit in the cold room. Last night a girl who carries ale for a living crossed my hall and made her laugh. A rustle went through the court. Sorrel could feel 200 eyes deciding what she was. Your Majesty, she said, because someone had to, and her voice came out steadier than she'd any right to expect. If I gave offense to the Queen Mother, the fault is mine alone and no one else's. The steward didn't know what offense. Varin tilted his head, and a slow, dangerous amusement moved across his face. Is that what you think I called you here for? It's usually what a summons is for, in my experience. That surprised a short laugh out of him, a real one, quickly caught. And she saw several courtiers exchange scandalized glances that a servant had spoken so plainly to the crown. Corwin, off to the side, made a small strangled motion with his hand. Stop talking, and she nearly did. Here is what's going to happen, the king said, and now he came down the steps toward her, unhurried, the way a wolf crosses open ground when it is in no particular rush. You are going to stay. You'll have rooms in the royal wing, a maid, a wage that will embarrass you. And you will spend your days at my mother's side. And you will give her back the thing this court took from her, which is the sound of her own mind. You'll be her voice, her hands, whatever you like to call it. He stopped in front of her. I've decided. The floor seemed to move under Sorrel's feet. Majesty, I'm a tavern girl. I can't live in the palace. It isn't. An unwed woman in the royal wing, with the run of... She was aware of the court, of the words it would put to it. They'll say things about why you'd keep me. Let them, said the king, and did not look away from her, and did not correct a single thing they might say. And something in the deliberate way he let the silence stretch told Sorrel that he knew exactly what conclusion the court would leap to about a king who installed a plain nobody at his own side, and that he intended to let them leap to it. A pretense neither of them had spoken, and neither would have to. She felt the trap close over her, soft as a glove. "There," he said quietly. "It's done." The court was dismissed. Corwin caught her eye once as he filed out, and the look on his face was not relief and not pride. It was something tighter, something calculating, gone before she could name it, and then he was gone with the rest. And then, absurdly, it was just the two of them and a hall the size of a barn. Varen's whole manner changed the moment the doors closed, the performance draining out of him, leaving something quieter and far more tired underneath. He sat down on the steps of his own dais like an ordinary, exhausted man. "You want to know why?" he said. "Really why?" "You could have hired an interpreter," Sorrel said, quietly, "paid me to teach one. You didn't need to make a spectacle of a serving girl in front of your whole court." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." He looked at her, and the amusement was entirely gone now. "My mother has been trying to tell me something, for months. The same signs, over and over, and every interpreter I've paid has given me a different lie because none of them can truly read her and none will admit it. She's frightened, and I don't know of what, and she is the only person left in this palace I would trust with my life." His jaw tightened. "Last night I watched a tavern girl understand her in the space of a breath. So no, I didn't need a spectacle. I needed you, and I wasn't going to risk you slipping back into the lower city where I'd never find you again." Sorrel stood very still. "So there it is," Varen said, and the ghost of the court smile came back, thin and unconvincing. "Welcome to the palace, Sorrel of the Hollow Oak. Try not to look so much like a woman walking into a cage." She didn't answer. She was thinking about the Queen Mother's face the night before, the fear underneath the joy, there and gone. She'd seen it. She just hadn't known to be afraid of it yet. The royal wing was quieter than any place Sorrel had ever lived, and at first the quiet frightened her more than the court had. In the lower city, silence meant something had gone wrong. Here it was simply what wealth sounded like. She learned the shape of her days quickly. Mornings she spent with Ondine, and the mornings were the best part. The Queen Mother woke early and hungry, not for food but for talk, 9 years of it dammed up behind her eyes, and the moment Sorrel's hands were free she would begin, telling her about the garden and the birds she could not hear but could feel through the soles of her feet when they landed on the terrace rail, about the husband she'd loved and the son she couldn't reach, about which of the maids stole and which only looked as though they did. Sorrel answered, and asked, and for the first time in her life used the language her mother had given her for hours at a stretch, until her hands ached pleasantly the way another woman's feet might ache after dancing. She had not understood how lonely she'd been until she wasn't. "You watch her like she'll vanish," Varen said one afternoon. He had a way of appearing in doorways without troubling anyone to announce him, and leaning there as if he had all the time in the world, which as king he supposed he did. "I watch everyone," Sorrel said, not turning. "It's a habit. You learn it carrying trays. And what does watching everyone teach you about me? That you come to see her every day now, and you didn't before I came." She did turn then. "You stand in that door, and you don't come in, because you can't speak to her and it shames you. You'd rather she thought you were busy than know you didn't have the words." The king was quiet a moment. In the daylight, his eyes were the flat grey of river ice, and just then, something moved under them. "You're not afraid of me at all, are you?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I've been afraid of better men than kings," Sorrel said, and went back to Ondine. But she was lying, a little, and the lie was this: she was beginning to be afraid of him, only not in the way a servant fears a crown. She was afraid of the way the room tilted toward him when he entered it, the low pull of an alpha that her own wolf answered before her sense could stop it. She was a lower city wolf, runt-born, the kind that never expected a mate and had made her peace with it young. It was safer to want nothing. Wanting was how you got taught your place. The warning came in pieces, and it came because Sorrel finally asked. "Your son says you've been trying to tell him something," she signed, one grey morning, when the maids had gone. "For a long time. He says no one could read it." Ondine's hands went still in her lap. The hunger drained out of her face and left something older underneath, something Sorrel recognized from the feast: fear, banked low and long. "They read it," the Queen Mother signed at last. "They chose not to." Her hands moved carefully now, glancing at the door between each phrase. "Something is wrong in this house. I smell it. A rot under everything, months old. Poison and money. And a false friend close to my son? Closer than his own guard? Her jaw tightened. I signed it 100 ways. Every interpreter my son hired nodded and told him I was asking after my late husband's grave. Everyone. Ask yourself, girl, who hires the interpreters? Sorrel's hands paused over her answer because she did not yet want to know. There's a mark, Ondine went on, relentless now that the dam was open. On the papers that come and go the wrong way. I saw it once, over my husband's shoulder, the winter before he died. A seal with no house behind it, a wolf's head and a chain, and the chain is broken. Her hands shaped it in the air between them, careful as a woman handling something hot. I have smelled that same wax 3 times since, on 3 men who had no business near the treasury. Find whose seal that is, girl, and you find the rot, but be careful whose hands you put it in. Her eyes flicked just once toward the door through which the household passed 100 times a day. The last person I trusted with it is why I stopped signing at all. Sorrel filed the broken chain away the way she filed everything, quietly, completely, and did not let herself follow the thought to the end of the corridor, where the steward's study was, and where the man who'd raised her kept his own seals under lock. That night she couldn't sleep, and so she was awake and dressed when she heard it, not a sound so much as a wrongness, the particular hush of a thing moving that means to move unheard. Her rooms adjoined Ondine's. She was through the connecting door with her heart in her throat before she decided to be. A figure stood over the Queen Mother's bed. Sorrel didn't shout. Shouting was for people with time. She crossed the room low and fast and hit the shape at the knees, and they went down together in a tangle of limbs and overturned furniture, and she got a fistful of cloak and a knee where it counted before a gauntleted hand cracked across her cheek and threw her off. By the time she found her feet, the figure was gone, out the terrace window, over the rail, down into the black garden, and Ondine was sitting bolt upright, awake, one hand pressed flat to the mattress, feeling the running vibration of the intruder's flight fade through the stone. The guard came too late, the way guards do. And Varin came behind them barefoot in a half-laced shirt, his composure entirely gone, and when he saw his mother safe and Sorrel bleeding from the cheekbone, he stopped in the doorway as though he'd hit a wall. They weren't here for you, Sorrel told him, her voice not quite steady, pressing her sleeve to her face. They went past your wing to reach hers. Whatever your mother knows, she looked at Ondine, small and straight-backed in the wreck of her room. Someone wants her to stop knowing it. She's the one they're afraid of, not you. And she watched the king of Oldmere understand, all at once, that the one person he trusted with his life was being hunted for a warning he had spent 9 years too proud to learn how to hear. He crossed the room and knelt at his mother's bedside, and for a long moment he simply held her hand in both of his, this enormous man made small, and Ondine looked at Sorrel over his bowed head with an expression Sorrel would not forget, grief and vindication and a terrible tenderness, the face of a woman finally believed on the worst possible night to be right. Later, when the window was barred and Sorrel was pressing a cold cloth to her splitting cheekbone in the corridor, Varin found her. You could have stayed behind the door and called the guard, he said. You put yourself between a knife and my mother instead. The guard was down the hall, I wasn't. I've a palace full of people who wouldn't have moved, and I'm related to half of them. He reached out, slow enough that she could have stopped him, and turned her face gently to the lamplight to see the damage, his thumb careful along the bone. Next time, he said quietly, I would like to be standing between the knife and you for once. She should have said something sharp. She was too tired and his hand was too warm, and so she said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer, and they both knew it. After that, everything changed, and nothing did, and Sorrel spent the better part of a month unable to tell which was worse. The king doubled the watch on his mother's rooms and told the court it was for her health. He wanted to know everything Ondine knew, and Ondine, now that someone could finally carry her words, doled them out in fragments, a name half-scented, a memory of a ledger left open, a night she'd felt 2 men arguing through the floor and smelled coin and fear on both of them. It was not enough to accuse anyone. It was more than enough to get her killed. So Sorrel became the thread between them, in the Queen Mother's rooms by day, and by night, going back over everything she'd ever overheard carrying trays, because a girl who went unseen heard a great deal, and some of it was starting to fit. And in the middle of all of it, against every scrap of sense she owned, she was falling for him. It crept, the way the worst things do. He started coming to the morning lessons. He would sit across from his mother, clumsy and enormous and mortified, and Sorel would teach him, "This is your name, this is hers, this is, I'm sorry it took me so long," and his big hands would fumble the shapes like a boy at his letters, and Ondine would laugh at him and correct him, and the first morning he managed good morning. Mother without help, she wept openly, and so, nearly did Sorel, and had to leave the room to pretend she hadn't. She could forgive a man a great deal she was learning for trying. He was maddening in every other way. She would corner him on the danger. "Who do you suspect? Why won't you name them? What aren't you telling me?" And he would answer sideways, so smoothly she wouldn't notice the question had gone unanswered, until he'd already moved them 3 subjects on, and was asking whether she knew her eyes went gold at the edges when she was angry. She kept score. It was another habit from the trays. Note what doesn't add up, and wait. His list was getting long. He knew more than he said. He watched Corwin across the council floor a beat too long. He'd had her installed at his mother's side with the whole court as witness, and a man that careful did nothing by accident, and some cold, wary part of her that had never fully trusted anyone kept whispering, "He wants something. They always want something. Find out what before it costs you." But then he'd catch her watching and smile like she'd caught him, and her wolf would turn over, warm and stupid, and the whispering would go quiet. She went to see Corwin, once in the second week. She told herself it was to thank him. He'd kept his post, after all, had somehow talked the court down from the ledge she'd walked them onto. But really she went because he was the nearest thing to family she had, and the palace had begun to feel like a place with too many locked doors. He received her warmly, poured her the good wine, sat her by his fire like he had when she was 11 and starving. He asked after her cheek, which was still yellow at the edges. He asked gently whether the work suited her. And then, just as gently, folding his hands. "And the old woman. What does she fill your head with, all those long mornings? They say she sees plots in the porridge, poor soul. Grief does that, when it's got nowhere to go." He smiled, sad and kind. "Don't let her frighten you with ghosts, Sorrel. There's no rot in this house, but what an old woman's loneliness dreams up." She almost told him. The words were on her hands. A seal with a broken chain, have you ever? And something older than her trust in him. A wariness bred in the lower city, closed her fingers before they moved. She smiled instead and said the porridge was fine and the mornings were long, and she drank his good wine. And she left, and she could not for the life of her have said why her heart was beating faster in the corridor than it had been in the room. She put it down to nerves. She was wrong, and being wrong would nearly cost her everything, but that was still weeks away, and for now she filed the strange fast heartbeat under tired and let it go. It broke one night on the east terrace, where she'd gone to be alone with the cold and found him already there. "You're supposed to be asleep," she said. "So are you." He didn't look at her. He looked at the dark garden where a woman had gone over the rail a month ago. "I keep the watch myself some nights. It's the only time I'm sure of it." She came to stand beside him at the rail, closer than she meant to. The wind moved his scent to her, pine and cold iron and something underneath that was only him, and her whole body leaned a half-degree toward it before she caught herself. "You should hate me," he said quietly. "I dragged you out of a life and put you between my mother and a knife, and I've told you almost nothing. By any sense you should hate me." "I know." Her voice had gone rough. "I'm cross about it constantly." He turned. He was very close. "And yet," he murmured, and lifted one hand, clumsy still but sure of this shape at least, because she'd taught it to him and he'd practiced it where she couldn't see, and signed, slow and deliberate against the dark. "I want you." Sorrel stopped breathing. "Tell me to stop," he said aloud, "and I'll never do it again. I mean that. You've the whole of my word." His hand hovered, not touching her, waiting. "Or teach me the sign for the other thing." Her pulse was a drum. Every cautious, tray-carrying instinct she had told her that men like him did not want women like her, that this was how the clever ones made a fool of you, that she should turn and walk inside and keep her place and keep herself. Instead, she took his hand and folded his fingers into the shape and pressed it to her own heart so he'd feel it and signed it back. There was no audience for it, and that undid her more than anything Sorrel had been wanted before, for her hands, for her sharp eyes, for the extra pair of arms at a busy table. She had never once in her life stood in the path of a man's plain, helpless wanting aimed at her, with nothing to be got from it and no one watching to be impressed. When he kissed her on the dark terrace, it wasn't careful and it wasn't kingly. His hands came up to frame her face like she was the one worth guarding, and he made a low sound against her mouth when she kissed him back that went straight through her, and she fisted her hands in his half-laced shirt and stopped keeping score. And her wolf, which had never expected a mate, which had made its small peace with wanting nothing, her wolf woke. It came through where they touched, not just his warmth and his weight, but him, his wanting and his fear and his relief pouring raw down a channel that hadn't existed a breath ago and now ran between them like a struck chord. The bond. She felt him feel her feel it. He pulled back a hand's width, grey eyes blown black, and she saw the same astonished terror on his face that was surely on hers. That's, his voice cracked, Sorrel, that's a, don't say it. Because if he said it, it was real, and if it was real, she had everything to lose. Don't. Not tonight. So he didn't. He said her name instead, over and over, like a man learning a language, and took her inside out of the cold. And here was the thing she hadn't braced for. He was not, in the dark, the king or the performance, or the man 3 moves ahead. He was clumsy with her the way he was clumsy with the signs, careful and astonished and undone, and when the bond opened wider, she felt straight through it that he was as frightened as she was, not of her, but of how much. A wolf who had learned young that everything he loved got used against him, laying it all down anyway. She had thought she was the only one who'd made her peace with wanting nothing. She'd been wrong about that too. I don't understand you, she whispered against his throat, sometime in the smallest hours. You could have anyone, any lady in that hall would. I don't want the hall. His arm tightened around her. I've spent my whole life being looked at by people who see a crown. You looked at me across a council floor like you were deciding whether I was worth the trouble. She felt him smile into her hair. No one's done that since my mother. It turns out it's the only thing I've ever wanted and the one thing none of them could counterfeit. For one night, the palace and its rot and its false friends did not exist. There was only the 2 of them, and the dark, and the new bright terrible thread strung between their ribs, drawing tight, and somewhere under her happiness, so quiet she could almost ignore it, the cold small voice that had kept her alive her whole life, asking why a man who guarded every truth had given her this one so easily. The alliance envoys arrived 4 days later, and the whole court put on its brightest face to greet them. It was the envoys of the Marchlands, come to seal a treaty that had taken 2 years to build. A hall full of foreign wolves and dangerous courtesy, exactly the wrong week for a knife in the dark. Which was, Sorrel would think later, precisely why the knife came then. She smelled it before she saw it. She was crossing the hall with the Queen Mother on her arm when her wolf snarled a warning up her spine, and she followed it to a servant she didn't know pouring the king's cup at the high table. The bitter almond ghost under the wine so faint that in a room this size only a wolf with a reason to be watching would ever catch it. She didn't think. She let go of Ondine, crossed the last 10 feet at a dead walk, and put her hand flat over the cup as the king reached for it. Don't, she said, low and even, smiling for the benefit of the room. Your Majesty, not that one. Varen's eyes met hers. He read her face in a heartbeat, and to his enormous credit he laughed as though she'd said something charming, and set the cup down, and slid his arm around her waist and drew her close as if it were nothing but a lover's whisper. Under the noise of it his voice was ice. How much? Enough. First a knife over your mother's bed last month, now poison at your own treaty table. She kept her own smile fixed. Someone in this house wants you dead badly enough to try it in front of a foreign court. You will say nothing. His arm tightened. The words came fast and quiet against her hair. Not to the guard, not to Corwin, not to a soul. If word breaks that a king was nearly poisoned at his own treaty table, the Marchlands ride home tonight and I lose 2 years of peace, and every man who dies in the war after is on my account. Do you understand me? So you smile, she said, disbelieving. You smile and pour a new cup and pretend. Yes. She pulled back to look at him, and the man from the terrace was gone. What stood in his place was the king. The court thought they knew. Smooth, closed, certain. And something in his face had gone hard and calculating in a way that frightened her more than the poison had, because it was the face of a man already 3 moves ahead of her, playing a game she hadn't known was on the board. Trust me, he said, and kissed her temple for the watching room and left her standing there. She gave him a count of 30. Then she followed, because she had never once done as she was told, and because the cold, tray-carrying part of her had started whispering again, and this time she was listening. She trailed him out of the hall, down a servant's stair, along a passage she'd scrubbed floors in another life, and stopped at the turn because the King of Oldmere had let himself into the steward's private study with a key he shouldn't have had, and shut the door, and she could hear, very faintly, the sound of a locked drawer being forced. Corwin's drawer. The man who'd raised her. Sorrel stood in the dark with her hand against the cold stone and felt the first thread of everything she'd let herself believe begin, quietly, to fray. She did not knock. She had scrubbed the flagstones outside that door on her knees 100 times in another life, and she knew the latch gave if you lifted as you turned, and so the King of Aldmere looked up from the steward's forced drawer to find his mother's interpreter standing in the doorway with her whole face coming apart. For once in his life, Varin had no ready thing to say. "Tell me you got lost," Sorrel said. Her voice didn't sound like hers. "Tell me you came down the wrong stair. Give me something, and I'll take it. I swear I will. I'm that much of a fool tonight." He set the papers down. That was the worst of it. Not a denial, not a clever turn, just the careful, terrible gentleness he used on frightened men. "I've been building a case against your steward," he said quietly, "for the better part of a year." The floor seemed to move. Corwin. The supplies that never arrive. The orders that cancel each other. Coin bled out of the treasury into a house that shouldn't have two coppers to rub together, dressed up under a seal with no name to it. His jaw tightened. "A wolf's head and a broken chain. My mother's been trying to hand me that seal for 9 years, and every interpreter who might have told me was hired by the man it points to." "No." She said it to the memory of the fireside, the good wine, the sad kind smile. "Don't let her frighten you with ghosts." "No, he raised me. He pulled me out of the gutter when my mother died. He didn't have to. There was nothing in it for him." Varin was silent a beat too long. "Say it," she whispered. "A girl who owes you everything," he said, so low she barely heard it, "and goes unseen and hears every word a room lets fall, and is grateful enough never to ask why. That is not nothing to a man running a long theft, Sorrel. That is the most useful thing he could own." He watched the words land like blows. "I don't say he never cared for you. I say a man like that never does one thing for one reason." She thought she might be sick, because she could feel it fitting the way he'd asked, always so gently, what the household said, what she overheard, who came and went, the way she'd been placed at that feast at all. Why were you really in that hall? She had never once asked who put her there. "You used me too." She rounded on him because it was easier than the other thing. That's what this was. A tavern girl who could read your mother and happened to belong to the very man you were hunting. You didn't install me at her side for her. You did it for him, to put your own eyes inside his house, wearing a face he trusted. At first. He didn't flinch from it, and she hated that he didn't. "I won't lie to you now to make it kinder. When I saw you reach my mother across that hall, yes, the first thing I felt was there's my way in. You were Corwin's ward and my mother's voice in one impossible girl, and I moved before I'd thought about your heart at all." He came around the desk and she stepped back and he stopped, exactly as far as she'd allow. "And then I knew you. And it stopped being that so fast it frightened me. And I couldn't tell you what it started as without losing you. So I said nothing, and that was a coward's arithmetic, and I did it anyway. You should have told me." Tears were coming now and she let them. "You watched me bleed for your mother. You let me open the bond to you, and every day you knew, and you let me love a thing that started as a use. Because you'd have warned him." His voice cracked at last. "You'd have gone straight to Corwin, certain in your good heart that there was some mistake, and he'd have known I was close, and he'd have buried it, the coin, the seal, my mother, and I'd have lost the one witness I have and you along with it. I couldn't risk you until you'd seen him for yourself. So you seduced me instead." The word was ugly, and she used it on purpose. "Kept me close and warm and grateful the way he did. You're not so different, the two of you. You both found a use for the invisible girl. That's not." He stopped himself, and she watched him choose honesty over comfort again, watched it cost him. "The night I kissed you on that terrace, I had already decided to send you back to the hollow oak with a purse and a lie, because I'd realized I couldn't keep using you and live with it. And then you signed my mother's warning back to me with your hands shaking, and I understood I'd left it too late, that I'd stopped being able to tell where the strategy ended, and I began. I have never in my life been unable to tell that, Sorrel. You did that to me. It terrified me. So no, I am not so different from him. I only got caught by my own trap a great deal harder than I meant to." Every question she'd ever asked him rearranged itself as he spoke. The gentle, "What did you overhear? Who came and went? Does the steward keep late hours?" She'd thought it was interest in her world. It had been interest in her master. And underneath that, buried so deep she'd never once dug for it, the same soft questions in Corwin's mouth across 20 years of firesides, and she had answered both men freely and loved them both for asking, and neither had wanted the girl at all, only what the girl could see. "You're the one person in this palace I never once suspected," Varen said. "Do you know why? Because my mother trusted you on sight, and my mother has not been wrong about a soul since she lost her hearing. She reads what the rest of us cover up. She smelled the lie on Corwin 9 years ago. She has never smelled one on you." It was a good answer, every word of it. And that was unbearable, because a good answer was exactly how a clever person made you a fool, and she no longer knew which of the two men in her life had done that to her, or whether it was both. "I don't believe you about him," she said. "I can't. If I let go of the one true thing I've ever had, there's nothing left of me at all." "Sorrel. Good night, Your Majesty." She walked out into the dark corridor, and she had not gone 10 paces before a shape detached itself from the shadows by the cold hearth, where it had been standing, she would realize far too late, for quite some time. "There you are," said Corwin, warm as firelight, opening his arms. "Child, you're shaking. What has he done to you?" She went to him. God's help her. She went straight into his arms like she was 11 again, because her whole world had just come down and he was the last wall left standing, and he held her while she wept and stroked her hair and made the low sounds he'd made over a starving thief he'd found stealing bread a lifetime ago. "Hush now," Corwin murmured. "I've got you. I always have." And that was the thing that saved her in the end. That word, always. Because some cold, watchful corner of her, the part that never fully slept, turned it over the way it turned over everything, and heard underneath it not comfort but possession, and went very still. "He says terrible things about you," she said into his shoulder, testing. "Coin. A seal. He says you've been stealing from the crown for years." Corwin's hand paused in her hair for the smallest fraction of a breath, then it resumed. "Does he?" he said, sorrowful. "Oh, my girl, he's cleverer than I feared, and crueler. Listen to me now." He set her back to arm's length and looked into her face, and his own was grave and gentle and entirely, perfectly kind. "It is worse than you know, and I would have spared you it. The king you've given your heart to, Sorrel, he put his own father in the ground to take that throne 9 years early. And the old woman knows. That's her warning. That's what she's been clawing at all this time, and it's why he keeps her caged and mute, and why the moment a girl appeared who could give the Queen Mother a voice, he snatched you up and shut you in the royal wing where he could watch every word your hands made." He squeezed her shoulders. "You were never his mother's helper, child. You were her muzzle." It was masterful. It was so nearly perfect that for one lurching moment she believed it. Because she wanted to, because if Varen was the monster, then she hadn't been a fool to love the wrong man, she'd only been a good woman deceived, and there was a terrible comfort in that. Corwin had always known exactly which door to open in her. He'd been opening them since she was 11, and then it fell apart, because she was the one person alive who knew exactly what the Queen Mother had actually signed, in her own hands, in the grey morning quiet, "A false friend close to my son, closer than his own guard," and that was not an accusation against a son. That was an accusation against a steward. Ondine had never once, in all their mornings, pointed at Varen. She had pointed over and over at a man who hired her interpreters and carried a broken chain seal, and had, Sorrel now understood with the slow horror of a flaw giving way, arranged for a certain grateful, invisible tavern girl to be hired into a certain feast, so that when the old interpreters were finally found out, he'd have a fresh loyal mouth of his own already placed at the Queen Mother's side. He hadn't counted on her reaching Ondine in front of the whole court. He hadn't counted on the king getting to her first. Every kindness he'd ever shown her rearranged itself in the space of a heartbeat into a ledger. The bread he'd given a starving thief, so she'd never steal from anyone but on his say-so. The roof, so she'd have something to lose. The honest work in houses where careless lords let secrets fall in front of the servants, and a quiet girl who owed him everything carried each one home to his fire, like a cat bringing a bird to the step. He'd told her once that she had a gift for going unseen, and he'd said it so warmly that she'd kept it like a jewel for 20 years. He had not been praising her, he had been describing his instrument. The grief of it was so large she couldn't feel the bottom. But under the grief, cold and clear, ran the other thing. The understanding that both men in her life had begun by using her. and that only one of them had wept about it in a locked study and told her the ugly truth to her face when a lie would have kept her. And only one of them was lying to her right now, with his warm hands on her shoulders and his kind eyes on her ruined face, steering her toward a room where her grief could be spent like a coin. So Sorrel did the hardest thing she had ever done. She let her face crumple further, and she leaned back into the arms of the man who had made her, and she whispered, "What do we do?" Corwin's kind eyes sharpened to points. "The Marchland's envoy sits in council within the hour," he said softly. "A king who'd murder his own blood is no king to bind a treaty to. They'll believe it, from the right mouth. Not mine. They'll say a steward grasps for power. It must come from someone whose love for the king is beyond doubt." His thumb brushed her cheek, almost tender. "It must come from you, child. Tell them the Queen Mother accuses her son. No one in that room will doubt her voice." "They'll doubt nothing," Sorrel agreed, and let him take her hand and let him lead her toward the council chamber and the longest walk of her life. One woman with no proof and no blade and nothing at all to flip his trap, but two clever hands and a room that had spent 9 years refusing to watch them. The Marchlands had taken the great East Council chamber, and it was full. The envoy and his stone-faced guard, the High Lords of Aldmere, Lord Aldous of House Vane near the front, with his soup-stained pride restored, and in a tall chair by the cold window where someone had parked her out of the way, the Queen Mother, watching everything and understood by no one. Varin stood at the center of it, and Sorrel saw the exact moment he spotted her come in on Corwin's arm. His whole face opened, hope, naked and foolish. And then he read who she walked beside and where his hand rested, and the light in him went out like a snuffed lamp. He thought she'd come to bury him. She let him think it. It was the only way this worked. "Your Excellency," Corwin said to the envoy, grave and grieving, "it wounds me to bring this before your treaty, but a crime sits at the head of this table, and the Queen Mother's own voice will speak it." He turned and held out a hand toward Sorrel, and the whole room turned with him. "Child, tell His Excellency what the Queen Mother knows." Every face swung to her. The envoy leaned in. Corwin waited, certain of his weapon. Varin looked at her the way a man looks at the blade already falling. Sorrel looked back at him, and, low against her skirts, where only the high seats could catch it, in the language a room full of the powerful had spent 9 years deciding wasn't worth learning, her hand said, "Trust me. The study. Send them now." She saw him not understand, and then, God's bless him, believe her without a shred of reason to. His eyes flicked once to the guard captain at the door. The captain slipped out. Corwin, watching only Sorrel's face, saw none of it. "His Excellency should hear it from the Queen Mother herself," Sorrel said aloud, and her voice carried clear to every corner of that cold room. "She's here. She has always been here. You've simply never asked her anything." She crossed the floor to Undine's chair and knelt, and took the old woman's hands in hers. And for the first time in 9 years, the court of Aldmere fell silent to watch the Queen Mother speak. "Tell them," Sorrel signed. "All of it. I'll be your voice, I swear it." And Undine told them. Her hands rose, sure and unhurried and blazing, and Sorrel gave them sound. "She says there is a seal that answers to no house, a wolf's head above a broken chain." Corwin went very still. "She says she saw it first the winter before her husband died, over papers that moved the wrong way. She says she has smelled its wax 3 times since, on 3 men found dead or vanished after, and on the hands of the man who hired every interpreter the crown ever set before her, the men who turned her warnings into questions about her husband's grave, so that no one would ever hear what she was truly saying." Sorrel's voice did not shake. Ondine's hands did not stop. "She says the false friend was never at the king's throat. He was at his back. He wears the steward's chain, and he carried her son's poison, and he has spent 9 years letting a court believe a grieving deaf woman had nothing to say, because a witness no one will listen to is the safest witness a thief can have." "This is grief," Corwin said, and his voice was still smooth, but a thread had gone out of it. "The old woman is confused and the girl is besotted and coached." "The girl," said Sorrel, rising, "has red hands her whole life, steward, and I have been reading yours for a month. You touch your left cuff when you lie. You did it at your own fireside when you told me there was no rot in this house." The guard captain stepped back through the door and gave the king a single nod, and Varin's mouth curved. "They've opened your study," Sorrel said gently. The seal is in the second drawer, under a false base, where you keep the good wines ledger. I scrubbed that floor for 2 years. I know every board in it. Corwin's kind face fell away all at once, and what was left underneath was the thing Ondine had smelled for 9 years. He moved fast for an old man. Sorrel saw his hand go for his left cuff, not to touch it this time, but to draw the thin blade sewn along the seam, and she saw it a full breath before it cleared the cloth, because she had watched hands when she couldn't watch mouths since before she could walk, and a hand going for a hidden knife has a shape all its own. She didn't try to fight him. She was runt-born and no blade hand, and she knew it. She simply threw herself sideways across the chair and took the Queen Mother down out of the line of it, wrapping the old woman in her arms as the knife came around, and the point that had been meant for Ondine's throat opened Sorrel's shoulder to the bone instead. Then the guards had him. It was over in the space of a gasp. The steward of the household face down on the Marchland's fine carpet, roaring, and the seal already on its way up the stairs in a captain's fist, and Sorrel on the floor with the Queen Mother safe and shaking in her arms and her own blood coming warm through blue silk. Varin reached her first. Of course he did. Sorrel. His hands were on her, on the wound, his face wrecked. You're bleeding, why did you? She can't hear you. Sorrel's voice was fading at the edges, but she got the words out because they mattered. She never could. Somebody in this room ought to have learned to tell her she's safe. She lifted her good hand and, for the Queen Mother, signed it. You're safe. It's done. They heard you. And Ondine pressed her forehead to Sorrel's and wept, and the whole court of Aldemir stood in perfect silence around two women on the floor, understanding, at last, every word. It was the second time in her life Sorrel had made an entire palace fall silent. The first time it had nearly destroyed her. This time the silence had a different weight to it. She could feel the room changing in it, could feel 200 people who had spent 9 years looking past a deaf woman finally, shamefully, seeing her. Lord Aldous of House Vane had gone the colour of ash. The Marchland's envoy had risen from his chair without seeming to know he'd done it, one hand pressed to his own heart in the old gesture of respect one gives a sovereign, offered 9 years too late. Varin was still holding her. You came in on his arm to break his neck, not mine, he breathed, dawning. You let me think, Sorrel. You saved all of us. I came for her. Sorrel nodded at Ondine, and made her voice as flat as she could make it, because it was the only armor she had left. And because a traitor is a traitor. Not one moment of it was forgiveness, Varin. You used me first. A bond doesn't unmake that. She let the guard's hands take her toward the physician's and did not look back at his face, because if she looked at his face she would forgive him, and she was so very tired of being a thing that other people found useful. She was voice of the Queen Mother for 6 months, and she was good at it, and everyone said so, and it did not fill the hole in her at all. The palace was a cleaner place by winter. Corwin sat in a cell beneath the old water gate, with the broken chain seal entered as evidence against him, and the whole rotten network he'd fed unraveling name by name. The treaty with the Marchlands held. The envoy had gone home telling anyone who'd listen about the deaf queen who'd unmasked a traitor with her hands. Ondine had a household now that spoke to her. Varin had commanded that every servant in the royal wing learn their letters in sign, and half the court had taken it up out of fashion, which Ondine found hilarious and said so, at length, to Sorrel, every morning. The mornings at least was still good. Ondine had become something Sorrel had no word for, not quite a mother, her own was 9 years gone, but the nearest thing since. The old woman scolded her and fed her, and once, memorably, threatened to sign filthy things at Lord Aldous across a state dinner until Sorrel stopped moping. It was Ondina, in the end, who said the thing no one else dared. He is dying by inches out there, she signed one grey morning, nodding at the window, at the courtyard where her son was pretending to review the watch and mostly looking up at Sorrel's window. And so are you. I have buried one great love already, girl. I did not get these mornings back only to watch you throw yours in the river out of pride. Because Varin had not stopped. That was the trouble. He courted her, and he did it in her own language, which was the cruelest and kindest thing he could have done. He could not write her a poem she'd read, so he learned to say it with his hands, badly, and said it anyway. She'd find him waiting outside the Queen Mother's rooms, and he would sign, slow and stubborn and mangling half the shapes, I was wrong. I should have told you. I am sorry he sent no flowers. He sent once a single sheet of paper covered edge to edge in his own careful drawings of hand shapes, a whole letter she could only read by making the signs herself, so that to hear him apologize she had to say the words with her own hands, in her own body, which undid her so completely she didn't leave her room for the rest of the day. And he did the other things too, the ones he never told her about, which she only heard of sideways and always too late. He stood down the levy that had been quietly starving the lower city guilds, Corwin's levy it turned out, feeding Corwin's seal. He pardoned 2 men Corwin had framed and pensioned their widows out of his own purse. He decreed that no petitioner to the crown could be turned away for being unable to speak or hear, and that the palace would keep interpreters honest ones could trust. And he named the post after no house and no saint, but simply the Queen Mother's grace, which made Ondine put her face in her hands for a long while the morning she learned of it. Sorrel told herself none of it was for her. She was fairly sure she was lying. That was the trouble with a man who stopped performing. You could no longer comfort yourself that the good things were part of the act, because there was no act left, only a wolf doing quiet right by people who'd never know to thank him, and hoping, without any longer daring to say so, that one of them was watching. She was. She hated that she was. She kept a tally of his decencies the way she'd once kept a tally of his lies, and the new list was longer, and she did not know what to do with a heart that had been trained its whole life to expect the bill to come due and could not find, however hard it searched, the catch in him anymore. Bex found her that evening, because Bex was captain of nothing but had appointed herself captain of Sorrel's good sense. "He freed my brother's guild from Corwin's levy," she said, dropping onto the cot the way she had 100 times over the hollow oak. "Did you know that?" "Didn't tell you. Didn't tell anyone. Odo says the whole lower city's calling him the wolf who learned to talk with his hands." She was quiet a moment. "You're miserable, Sorrel. He's miserable. The old queen's threatening to sign obscenities at nobles. At some point pride stops being armor and starts being the thing killing you." "I was used," Sorrel said to the wall. "I. And he told you so to your face when a lie would have kept you warm, which is more than the man who raised you ever did." Beck stood. "You forgave Corwin 20 years of it for a loaf of bread. You won't forgive Varen 6 months of trying to make it right." She let that sit. "Only you can say why that is, but I think you already know, and I think it frightens you more than any knife ever did." One night in the deep of winter, a last letter came, and it was different. No drawn hands, no shapes to puzzle out, just words, in plain script, because he'd finally understood he had no right to make her work to hear him anymore. "You've made yourself clear, and I'll honor it. I'll stop now. I only ever wanted you to be able to choose, and you've chosen, and I'd be a poor sort of wolf to keep crowding a door you've shut. Be well, Sorrel. The mornings suit you." She read it 3 times. It was everything she'd told him she wanted, so she could not understand why it sat in her chest like a stone, or why the warm, patient thread under her ribs, the one she'd spent 6 months trying to starve to death, chose that exact moment to pull tight and ache, as though somewhere out in the dark it had felt something she hadn't yet been told. The knock came an hour before dawn. It was Odo, grey-faced with Bex a step behind him, and Sorrel was on her feet before either of them spoke because the thread under her ribs had gone from ache to alarm. "The king's gone," Odo got out. "Not in his chambers, not anywhere. His sword's on its stand, his horse in the stable, no coin drawn. He's just gone, Captain says, since the middle bell, and the trackers caught his scent to the water gate and lost it clean, the way a scent stops when a man's carried." He was shaking. "They're keeping it quiet. If the court wakes to a missing king a month before the treaty's sealed—" "The broken chain," Bex said grimly. "Corwin was the hand. He was never the head. Whoever's left wants the boy dead and the marchlands blamed for it, and the treaty in the river with him." Sorrel was already moving, pulling her coat over the old wound at her shoulder that still ached when the weather turned. She had spent 6 months smothering the bond, holding it shut, hoping it would wither and set her free. It had not withered, it had only waited. And now she pressed her hand flat to her chest and, for the first time since the night on the terrace, she stopped holding the door and let it open. It hit her like a room with the roof torn off. Fear first, his cold and clamped down. Then pain, a deep wrong ache from the back of his skull. Then the slow, swimming, drowsy loosening of a mind pulling apart at the seams, thoughts drifting free of their moorings, drugged, and under all of it, threaded through it, one steady point that was not panic and not pain, a direction, a pull, the plain animal fact of him. That way, not far, down toward the water. He's alive, she breathed. He's south, below the water gate, in the old cisterns. Wake the captain, follow me, and be quiet about it. She was through the door before they could argue, following the pull of him hand over hand like a rope, hauling her through the dark, down through the sleeping palace, and out the postern into the bitter pre-dawn, down and down toward the black arches of the old cistern, where the pool ran hottest and a single lamp burned that had no business burning. She had spent 6 months learning to hate this bond, and now it was the only thing in the world she had. Every terrified beat of his failing heart came to her down the thread. Every time his thoughts guttered toward the dark, she felt them slip and hold on the connection like a woman hauling a drowning man off the bottom of a river. No, stay. Stay with me. I'm coming. Keep your eyes open, not knowing if he could feel her doing it anyway. Somewhere behind her, Bex was rousing the guard, and Odo was running for the captain, but they would follow the pull of her, and she followed the pull of him, and the whole chain of it held together on a bond she'd tried her level best to starve to death, which had, it turned out, only been keeping itself alive for exactly this. She should have waited for the guard. She didn't. She went in low along the water's edge, silent as a girl who'd spent her life going unseen, and she counted them by their voices before she ever saw them. 3, no, 4, and one of them Lord Aldous of House Vane, because of course it was, the peacock with the broken chain wax finally showing his true colors. And there, slumped against a pillar with his hands bound and his head lolling and a smear of dark blood in his dark hair, was Varin. He was fighting the drug with everything he had, and losing. But the bond was open now, wide open, and he felt her the instant she was near. She watched his head come up, watched him track blind toward her across the dark water though he couldn't possibly have seen her, and through the thread she felt it hit him all at once, disbelief and terror and a joy so violent it hurt. No, not you. They'll kill you. Run. And over the top of all of it, helpless. You came, I'm here, she signed, though he couldn't see it, because her hands didn't know how to say it any other way. Then she did what she was good at. Not fighting, watching. She read the room the way she'd read 100 crowded taverns, where each man stood, which watched the door, and which watched the king, the loose stone underfoot, the lamp she could put out with one thrown boot, not to blind them. Wolves saw well enough in the dark, but to rob them of the one thing they were counting on, a clear look at whatever came for the king. In the black they would have to find her first, and no one alive was better at not being found. She put out the lamp. What followed she would never fully be able to describe, except that she moved through the dark like the unseen thing she'd trained her whole life to be, and she got her knife through the ropes at Varen's wrists, and she pressed her back to his and her mouth to his ear, and said, "Stay behind me and hold on to my coat." And when the guard came pouring in behind her, because she'd led them straight to the pull of him, because the bond that finds also guides, she and the king of Aldmere were still standing. They took House Vane in the dark. It was, the captain said later, embarrassingly quick. Afterward, in the grey first light at the water's edge, she sat with Varen's head in her lap while the drug wore off him in waves, and she held his bound-marked wrists and could not stop touching his face to be sure of it. Through the open bond it all came to her unguarded, everything he was too weak to hide, not just the fear and the pain, but the 6 months underneath them, the whole long ache of it, the nights he'd stood the watch himself, because it was the only time he was sure his mother was safe and the only time he let himself think about her. The exact shape of what it had cost him to write that last letter and let her go. He had meant it. That was the thing that broke her. He had truly meant to set her free, and it had very nearly killed something in him to do it. And he'd done it anyway, because he'd decided her freedom mattered more than his own heart. No one had ever once, in her whole life, put her freedom above their use for her. She had not known until this moment that it was the only thing she'd ever wanted. He was too weak to speak and half gone besides. But he turned his hand over in hers, and with the last of what he had, clumsy and shaking and sure, he signed against her palm the only 3 things he had strength left to say. Sorry. A pause, gathering. Stay. And then, the shape he'd practiced 100 times where she couldn't see, the one he'd learned before he had any right to it. I love you. The king, who had armored himself in clever words his whole life, who had a smooth answer for every man who'd ever tried to reach him, reduced, at the bottom of everything, to his mother's silent language, because it was the only tongue he had left that couldn't lie. Sorrel bowed her head over him and felt 6 months of pride go out of her like a tide. Ask me again, she whispered, when you can stand, when you'll remember it. His eyes found her face and his mouth moved, and you'll say yes. And she pressed her lips to his bloodied forehead and did not answer, and let him feel straight down the open bond exactly what her answer was going to be. In the end, he asked her properly, and it took him a season, and he did it in her language every time, so there could never be a word of it he hadn't meant with his hands. He asked on the East Terrace, where she'd first taught him, I want you, sober and steady this time, and word perfect. He asked across the council table until the Marchland's envoy, back for the ceiling, threatened to learn sign himself just to object. He asked so badly one morning, mangling the shape so thoroughly that he accidentally proposed to a startled footman, that Ondine laughed until she cried. And every time, Sorrel told him to ask again, not out of pride now, but because she had learned that a thing worth having is worth making certain of, and because his face when he had to gather himself to ask a fourth time was frankly the best thing in the kingdom. Until one perfectly ordinary morning over cooling tea, with no ceremony and no court and no one watching but his mother pretending not to, she caught his hands halfway through the shape and held them still, and signed her answer into them so he'd feel it as well as see it. Yes. The whole city came out for the mating. The boy king nobody had taken seriously, and the tavern girl who'd read a queen's heart across a crowded hall before anyone else had bothered to look. He cried during the vows. She'd known he would, she very nearly didn't, and the bond gave her away regardless, and he laughed at her through his own tears, and she stopped caring who saw. And at the end, when it was done, the Queen Mother of Aldmere rose to give her blessing. 9 years the court had talked over this woman. 9 years they had decided a queen who could not hear was a queen who was no longer there. Now they stood in the great hall, the same hall where a nobody in a borrowed grey dress had once made her laugh, and they watched Ondine lift her hands, and they waited, every last one of them, for the tavern girl to give her voice. Sorrel didn't. She lifted her own hands instead and answered her, silent, so that the blessing passed between the two women the way it was meant to, in the language they shared. And one by one, understanding, the whole court fell quiet to watch it, 200 lords and ladies and a foreign king, holding their breath in perfect stillness, straining to read a language most of them had only just begun to learn, because the realest thing in the room was once again passing between a deaf queen and the girl who'd first thought to look at her. The entire palace fell silent. The first time that silence had fallen for her, it had nearly ended her. This time she stood in the middle of it and understood it for what it was, not scandal, not a nobody's disgrace, but an entire court finally learning to listen. If Varin had ever once, in the old days, turned his head to look at his own mother, none of it would have happened. Not the feast, not the fall, not the knife, nor the cistern, nor the girl. He had told her so himself, on the terrace, the night she said yes. So really, he'd signed, grinning, mangling it, when you think about it, all of this is my fault. Best mistake you ever made, she'd signed back. For once, she didn't argue.